I've been a law enforcement officer on the Shawnee National Forest for 14 years. In that time, I've written up everything from illegal dumping to meth labs to stolen vehicles stripped and abandoned on forest roads. I've helped carry out 2 people who died from falls at Garden of the Gods. I found a man having a cardiac arrest at his campsite near Pounds Hollow and kept him breathing until the ambulance got there from Harrisburg, which took 41 minutes. I've talked people off ledges. I've told families things no one should have to say out loud. 14 years gives you habits. Some of them are just practical checking your mirrors on the forest roads because ATVs come around blind curves, keeping a second flashlight in your vest because the first one always dies when you actually need it. Some of them are policy. Some are common sense. And then there's the one that's just mine. I don't go near open wells alone. That probably needs some context. The Shawnee isn't what most people think of when they hear National Forest. It's not the Cascades. It's not Montana. It's 289,000 acres of second-growth hardwood spread across the southern tip of Illinois, between the Ohio River and the Mississippi, chopped up into parcels that weave in and out of private farmland, county roads, and little towns that have been shrinking since before I was born. Golconda, Eddyville, Vienna, Herod, places where everybody knows which roads are Forest Service and which are county. And nobody's sure who's supposed to maintain the ones in between. Before it was a national forest, most of this ground was farmland. Homesteads, small holdings, family plots. During the Depression, the soil gave out, the farms failed, and the government bought the land, planted it with pine, and let the native hardwood come back on its own. But the people who lived here left things behind. Foundation stones, cisterns, wagon roads that the forest has mostly swallowed, but that you can still follow if you know how to read the terrain. Old cemeteries with hand-carved headstones going back to the 1830s. And wells. If you spend time off-trail in the Shawnee, you will find open wells. They're everywhere, especially on the old homestead sites in the rougher hollows where nobody ever came back to fill them in. Some are obvious. You'll see a ring of stacked fieldstone with dark water sitting 8 or 10 feet down. But some aren't obvious at all. The ground erodes, leaf litter accumulates, a few branches fall across the opening. You're walking through what looks like flat forest floor, and suddenly there's nothing under your next step. If you're someone who's only hiked the marked trails, you've probably never been near one. But the Shawnee has miles and miles of unmarked ground. Old wagon roads that don't appear on any current map. Ridgelines that people ride horses along without any formal trail designation. Hunters go off-trail constantly during bow and shotgun season. And then there are the people who come specifically looking for the old home sites, the history hikers, the relic hunters, the ones with the 1930s map overlays on their phones, trying to match little squares on the screen to depressions in the ground. We've had people fall in, not often, but enough that it's a known hazard. A broken ankle if they're lucky, worse if they're not. The wells are deep, and most of them hold water year-round because the water table in the hollows sits close to the surface. Falling in isn't the danger everyone imagines. Falling in and not being able to get back out, that's the real problem. Stone walls, slick with algae, no handholds, 8 to 12 feet down in a shaft 3 feet wide. Your cell phone doesn't get signal in most of the Shawnee's hollows. If you went alone, and nobody knows exactly where you are, you could be down there a long time. So my rule isn't irrational. It's just more absolute than it needs to be. And the reason for that goes back to the spring of 2019, which is the thing I've been putting off talking about for years. If this kind of story interests you, the ones that don't end up in the official report, the ones that experienced officers carry around, and don't bring up at the district office, subscribe to Ashwarden Horror. I've learned that the incidents people remember aren't the ones that get written down. They're the ones that change how you work. In March of 2019, I'd been on the Shawnee for about 7 years. I was comfortable. I knew the district well enough to navigate most of it without GPS, which matters more than you'd think when you're patrolling nearly 100,000 acres of fragmented forest with, at that time, 2 other LEOs to share the load. The western section was mine. Everything from the Magazine Ranger District boundary east to roughly Route 145. That included a lot of Pope County, a lot of rough hollows, a fair amount of the river-to-river trail, and a healthy stretch of the Lusk Creek drainage. Late March that year was wet. Not unusual for southern Illinois, but it was the kind of sustained rain that turns every drainage into a temporary creek and makes the forest roads close to impassable. I'd already had to reroute twice that week because of washouts. The kind of week where you spend more time on the radio with maintenance crews than you do actually patrolling. On a Thursday, I'm fairly sure it was Thursday because I remember having a scheduling conflict about the weekend shift. I got a call from the Hidden Springs Ranger District office in Vienna. Not dispatch, the recreation staff. A woman named Pam Ogden, who I'd worked with for years, told me that a group of hikers had called in about something they'd found off the river-to-river trail in the eastern part of my patrol area, roughly between Eddyville and the Lusk Creek wilderness boundary. Pam said the hikers had been doing a section hike, heading east, and had gone off trail to look at what they thought was an old home site. One of them had spotted daffodils blooming in a cluster that's a reliable indicator of a former homestead, because daffodil bulbs persist for decades after everything else is gone, and they'd walked maybe 200 yards off the main trail into a hollow to investigate. They found a home site. Foundation stones, a partial chimney stack, the usual debris field. And then one of them nearly stepped into a well. He caught himself, backed up, and they decided to report it because they were worried about other hikers. Normal enough. We get reports like that a few times a year. Usually I'll make a note, check the GPS coordinates if they have them, and try to get out there when the ground dries up enough to make it worth the trip. Sometimes we'll flag the area with trail tape. We don't have the budget or the equipment to fill these wells in, especially the ones deep in wilderness or in terrain where you can't get machinery. It's triage. We mark what we can, warn who we can, and hope nobody wanders into one at dusk. But Pam added something that changed the priority. The hikers told her that when they looked into the well, they saw something at the bottom that they couldn't identify. Not water, not leaves. They described it as fabric. One of them thought it looked like a piece of clothing. The well was too deep and too dark to see clearly, but all 3 of them agreed there was something down there that didn't look like it belonged. That's a different report. That turns a trail hazard flag into a potential recovery situation. I told Pam I'd head out the next day. The rain was supposed to break Friday morning, and I wanted dry enough ground to get my truck at least partway down the forest road that serviced that section. She gave me the coordinates the hikers had provided rough, because they'd pulled them from a phone app in a signal dead zone, but close enough to work with. Friday came in overcast, but dry. I left my house in Golconda around 7, drove west on 146, and turned north on one of the forest roads that parallels the Lusk Creek drainage. The road was soft but passable. I parked where a spur road dead-ended at a locked gate, one of the old access roads that maintenance uses maybe twice a year for prescribed burn staging, and walked in. The terrain in that part of Pope County is deceptive. You're on a ridge, and the forest looks level. And then suddenly the ground drops away into these narrow, steep-sided hollows carved by water through the sandstone. Some of them are only 50 or 60 feet deep, but the walls are near vertical in places, and the bottoms are choked with deadfall, moss, and in spring, knee-deep mud. Getting into them is easy. Getting out takes 3 times as long, and you're usually grabbing tree roots to pull yourself up slopes that feel steeper than they look. I found the home site without much difficulty. The daffodils were exactly where the hikers described a thick patch of them, blooming bright yellow in the understory about 30 feet from a creek that was running hard from the week's rain. The foundation was typical for the area. Field stones stacked without mortar, mostly collapsed, with a few courses still standing maybe 2 feet high on the uphill side. A single chimney remnant. Some rusted metal in the leaf litter that could have been a stoveplate or part of an implement. A yucca plant, another home site indicator growing against what would have been the south-facing wall. The well was about 40 feet northeast of the foundation, uphill, which was consistent with how homesteaders placed their wells relative to their houses and their outhouses. They put the well uphill to keep the water clean. You can almost always predict where the well will be once you find the foundation, if you understand the logic. I approached carefully. The well opening was roughly 3 feet in diameter, lined with dry stacked fieldstone that was still in decent shape despite probably 150 years of exposure. The rim was partially obscured by leaf litter and a couple of fallen branches, but it wasn't what I'd call hidden. If you were watching the ground, you'd see it. If you were looking at your phone or at the daffodils, maybe not. I cleared the branches, got on my hands and knees at the rim, and directed my flashlight down. The well was deep. I estimated 12 to 15 feet to the water surface, and the water was dark, which in these sandstone hollows usually means tannin-stained, not muddy. The shaft was clean, no roots growing through the walls, no significant collapse. And there was something at the water's surface. It wasn't a body. I want to be clear about that because my mind went there immediately. And I spent about 10 seconds in a very specific kind of focused calm that you develop after enough years of this work, where you're simultaneously preparing yourself for the worst outcome and cataloging what you're actually seeing so you don't contaminate your own observation with what you expect to see. What I was looking at was fabric. The hikers were right about that. It was a piece of fabric, roughly rectangular, maybe 18 inches by 12 inches, floating on the surface of the water. Dark material, possibly denim, possibly canvas. It was wet, which meant it was heavy enough to sit low in the water, but not heavy enough to sink. There were other objects near it. Some of them looked like they could be natural debris sticks, leaves, the usual accumulation. But some of them didn't look right. I could see what appeared to be a strap or a cord of some kind. Something pale that might have been plastic. I considered climbing down. The walls were solid enough that I could have braced myself between them, chimney style, and worked my way down. I've done it before in other contexts, but I was alone. The walls were damp, and the protocol for a potential recovery is clear. Secure the scene, call it in, wait for support. I pulled back from the rim, marked the well's GPS coordinates on my handheld unit, flagged the nearest tree with orange tape, and called it in on the radio. I got the Pope County dispatcher because I was out of range of the Forest Service repeater in that hollow. I gave them the location, described what I'd seen, and requested that they relay to the Forest Service and to the Pope County Sheriff's Office. Then I sat on a downed log about 20 feet from the well and waited. The backup situation on the Shawnee is something people from larger forests don't fully appreciate. The nearest other LEO that day was working the eastern end of the district, at least an hour and a half away by road and foot. Pope County Sheriff had maybe 2 deputies on shift for the entire county. The nearest search and rescue resources were volunteer-based and would need to be called in from Harrisburg or Marion, which is Williamson County, not even the same county. I waited about 2 hours. During that time, I did what you do when you're securing a scene alone. I walked a perimeter, looked for anything on the surface around the well that might be relevant, checked for footprints or sign. The ground was soft enough from the rain that tracks would have shown, and I found some. Mine, obviously, and what I initially counted as 2 other sets, which I assumed belonged to the hikers. They'd said they were a group of 3, and I figured the third person might not have come as close to the well. I documented the tracks with my phone camera. One set was a boot print, lug-soled, consistent with a hiking boot. The other was smoother, could have been a trail runner or a light shoe. Both appeared to approach the well from the same direction I had, roughly from the southwest, which was the natural approach from the river-to-river trail. Nothing else on the surface struck me as unusual. No trash, no gear, no clothing. Just the home site, the well, and the forest. Deputy Russ Maynard arrived first around noon. Russ was a guy I'd worked with on a handful of incidents over the years. Not a close friend, but someone I trusted in the field. He was solid, unhurried, and he knew the terrain. He'd grown up in Pope County and had probably explored more of these hollows as a teenager than I ever would on the job. He looked into the well with his own flashlight and agreed that what was down there warranted recovery. We discussed options. Neither of us had rope or harness gear with us. The shaft was too narrow for a standard rescue basket. We agreed to wait for the volunteer search and rescue team, who Russ said were on their way from Harrisburg. They arrived in 2 trucks around 1:30. 5 people. They had rope, harnesses, a tripod system they could set up over the well opening, and importantly, a waterproof work light they could lower on a cord. It took them about 30 minutes to set up. The team lead, a man named Gary, who I'd met once before at a joint training exercise, ran the rigging while Russ and I widened the cleared area around the well so that they had room to work. When they lowered the light, we all saw clearly what was in the well. The fabric was a section of a backpack. Not a modern pack, something older, with canvas construction and leather buckle straps. It was partially submerged, floating because of an air pocket caught in the main compartment. Beside it, tangled in what looked like a strap, was a coil of parachute cord. The pale object I'd seen was a Nalgene bottle, the old white plastic kind, half filled with water and bobbing against the wall of the shaft. There was no body, no bones, no clothing other than the pack itself. Gary's team rigged a volunteer to descend on the tripod. A young woman named Beck. I remember the name because she was completely calm about being lowered into a 150-year-old well on a Friday afternoon, and I remember thinking I wouldn't have been. She went down with a waterproof bag and a headlamp. She was down there for about 12 minutes. When they hauled her up, she had the backpack, the Nalgene bottle, the parachute cord, and 2 other items that hadn't been visible from above. A folded plastic tarp and a single hiking boot, men's size 11 or 12, with the lace still tied. The boot was what changed the temperature of the afternoon. A backpack in a well can have explanations. Someone throws an old pack down a hole to get rid of it. Gear falls off a rock ledge. Teenagers mess around. But a single boot with the lace still tied, sitting at the bottom of a well in a hollow that's half a mile from the nearest marked trail, that's harder to explain away. Russ and I looked at the boot together. It was a Merrill, brown leather, reasonably worn but not destroyed. The tread still had definition. The lace was tied in a normal bow, not a double knot. The boot was waterlogged but structurally intact. I said what we were both thinking, which was that it looked like the boot had come off someone's foot while the foot was still in it. Not unlaced, not kicked off. The tongue was pushed down and forward in the way that happens when a boot gets pulled off by suction, like when you step in deep mud and your foot comes out, but the boot doesn't. Or like when someone falls into a well and their boot catches on the wall on the way down. Russ asked Gary's team to lower the light again so we could examine the walls of the shaft below the waterline. The water was too dark and too deep to see the bottom. Gary estimated the total depth at probably 20 to 25 feet based on the length of rope they'd paid out before Beck touched water. We recovered everything. I bagged the items, labeled them, and documented the scene. Russ called the sheriff's office and reported what we'd found. The response was measured. No one was treating this as a confirmed emergency, but no one was dismissing it either. The sheriff's office agreed to run the boot and the backpack against any active missing persons reports in the region. The SAR team packed up. Russ and I walked back to our vehicles together, and he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said that when he was a kid, maybe 12 or 13, he and a friend used to explore the old home sites in the hollows south of Eddyville. He said they found a well once that had a plywood sheet over it, held down with rocks, and when they moved the rocks and lifted the plywood, the well was full of old household items. Dishes, a chair, glass bottles. He said his grandmother told him that when families left their homesteads during the Depression, some of them threw everything they couldn't carry into the well before they walked away. She called it closing the house. He said this was the first time he'd heard of a boot being in one. The sheriff's office ran the check. No active missing persons cases in Pope County matched the items. No recent reports from the surrounding counties either. They expanded the search to statewide and came back with nothing that fit. The backpack had no identification inside, no tags, no name written in marker, no receipts or papers. The canvas was old enough to be ambiguous. It could have been from the 80s or the 90s, or it could have been a reproduction vintage style. The leather straps were dried and cracked, but not rotted. The Nalgene bottle was a model that had been manufactured continuously for decades, so it was no help for dating. The parachute cord was standard 550, available at any surplus store or outdoor shop in the country. The boot was the most specific item, and even that told us very little. Merrill Moab, men's, size 11, one of the best-selling hiking boots in America. I probably passed 10 pairs of them on any busy weekend at Garden of the Gods. Nothing matched, nothing connected to anything. And on paper, that should have been the end of it. But I didn't file it away, and the reason was the tracks. I mentioned earlier that I'd found 2 sets of footprints near the well, which I'd assumed belonged to the hikers who reported it. That assumption held up until I got back to my truck and looked at the photographs on my phone more carefully. The hikers had reported a group of 3, 2 men and a woman. The boot prints I'd photographed near the well included 1 set of lug-soled hiking boots and 1 set of smoother-soled shoes. Both sets approached the well from the southwest. Both sets retreated the same way. That was consistent with 2 of the 3 hikers going up to the well while the 3rd stayed back, which is exactly what they'd told Pam on the phone. The problem was the smooth-soled prints. They were everywhere around the well, not just approaching and retreating, but circling. Multiple passes. The person wearing those shoes had walked around the well at least 3 or 4 times at varying distances, some prints less than a foot from the rim. I hadn't noticed this on the ground because the light was flat under the overcast sky and the mud made everything look uniform unless you were specifically studying it. But in the photographs, with the contrast adjusted, the pattern was clear. No one circles a well 4 times after nearly falling into it. You find it, you back up, you leave. You don't walk laps around it. I called Pam and asked if she still had the contact information for the hikers who'd reported the well. She did. I reached the man who'd made the call. His name was Dennis, a section hiker from Mount Vernon, which is about 90 minutes north. He confirmed 3 people, 2 men and a woman. He was the one who'd nearly stepped in. He said all 3 of them backed away immediately and returned to the trail. He said none of them circled the well. I asked what shoes they were wearing. Dennis said he had hiking boots. His friend Kyle had hiking boots. His girlfriend was wearing trail runners. Hocus, he thought. Trail runners have lug soles, not smooth. So the smooth-soled prints didn't belong to any of the 3 hikers. Someone else had been at that well, recently, after the last rain, which meant within the past 2 days. And they hadn't just walked up and looked. They had circled it, methodically, multiple times. I drove back out the next morning with Russ. Part 2. Russ met me at the gate on the forest road at 7:15 Saturday morning. He'd brought coffee in a thermos and a pair of rubber boots because he said the hollow would be worse than the day before. Something about how the water table in those sandstone drainages rises for a full day after the rain stops, like a delayed reaction. He was right about that. I'd seen the same thing dozens of times. The creeks in the Shawnee's hollows don't peak during the storm. They peak the day after, once the water has worked through the rock. We walked in together. It took about 40 minutes from the gate, mostly because the descent into the hollow was slick and neither of us wanted to twist an ankle on a Saturday when the nearest ambulance was 45 minutes out. The well looked the same. My orange flagging tape was still on the tree. The tripod marks from the SAR team's setup were visible in the mud. Everything was as I'd left it, except the tracks. The smooth-soled prints I'd photographed the day before were still visible, though softened by overnight moisture. But now, there were new ones. Same shoe, same smooth sole, same pattern circling the well, some prints within inches of the rim, others farther out. The new prints overlaid the SAR team's boot prints in several places, which meant they'd been made after we left. After we'd all packed up and driven away Friday afternoon. Someone had come back to the well in the window between late Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. Russ saw it too. He squatted near the rim and studied the tracks without touching anything, moving his flashlight at a low angle to catch the definition. After a while, he said, "These aren't the same visit." I agreed. "How many times has this person been here?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. The rain earlier in the week would have erased anything older than about Wednesday. So at minimum, someone had visited the well once between Wednesday and Friday before the hikers arrived, and once after we left Friday. But if the person had been coming before the rain, there was no way to know. We walked the perimeter wider this time. Russ took the north side, and I took the south. We were looking for a trail, any sign of where the smooth-soled visitor was entering and leaving the hollow. I found it about 30 yards south of the well, on the slope that climbs out of the hollow toward the ridgeline. A faint path through the leaf litter. Not a trail in any official sense, not even an old wagon road, just a line of disturbance where someone had been walking the same route enough times to compress the leaves into a narrow track. It went uphill, switchbacking once around a sandstone outcrop, and emerged on the ridge above the hollow, maybe 150 feet from the well. On the ridge, the track became harder to follow. The ground was drier up there, more rock, less mud. But Russ picked it up again, heading roughly south-southeast, paralleling the hollow. We followed it for about a quarter mile before it intersected a forest road, an unmarked 2-track that I knew connected eventually to a county road near Eddyville. There were tire tracks on the 2-track. A vehicle had been parked there recently. You could see the impression where the tires had sat long enough to settle into the soft shoulder. The tread pattern looked like a standard all-terrain tire, nothing distinctive. The vehicle had pulled in heading south and left heading south. Russ wrote down everything while I photographed it. Neither of us said anything dramatic. We didn't need to. The picture was straightforward. Someone was driving to this forest road, parking, walking a quarter-mile along the ridge, descending into the hollow, circling the well, and leaving. And they'd done it at least twice in the past few days. Russ asked if I wanted to set up surveillance. I told him I didn't have a trail camera to spare. The district owned about 6 of them total, and all of them were deployed on active cases involving illegal dumping sites and a marijuana grow operation we'd been monitoring in Hardin County. He offered to bring one of the county's game cameras, which weren't technically law enforcement equipment, but which the sheriff's office used informally for similar purposes. We agreed he'd set it up the following week. In the meantime, I'd pull the forest road records to see if that 2-track had any recent maintenance or access requests. On the Shawnee, a lot of the old forest roads technically require permission or a key for vehicle access. But in practice, the gates are often damaged, missing, or propped open by locals who've been using the roads for decades. Enforcement is a losing game when you've got 3 officers for 300,000 acres. I pulled the records Monday morning. The 2-track was designated Forest Road 1284B. It had been gated at the County Road intersection, but the gate log showed no authorized access since the previous fall, when a prescribed burn crew had used it as a staging area. No maintenance requests, no special use permits. The gate itself, when I drove out Tuesday to check, was closed but not locked. The lock hasp was rusted in the open position. Anybody with a vehicle could have driven through. That week, I also followed up on the recovered items. The sheriff's office had submitted the backpack and boot to the state crime lab, but realistically, without a missing person to connect them to, they'd sit in the queue for months. The parachute cord and tarp were generic enough to be useless as evidence. The Nalgene bottle was clean, no fingerprints that survived the water. I should say something here about how this felt, because I think if I describe only the procedural steps, it sounds clinical, and it wasn't. I was irritated, not scared, not intrigued, irritated. I had a full caseload the grow operation in Hardin County, 2 active vandalism investigations at campgrounds, a complicated trespass dispute on a private in-holding near One Horse Gap, and the usual volume of spring season visitor contacts that eat your weekends from March through May. The last thing I wanted was an ambiguous situation in a remote hollow that generated questions I couldn't answer and paperwork I couldn't close. And there was something else. The circling bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate to Russ or to my supervisor without sounding irrational. Walking around a well isn't a crime. It isn't suspicious in any legally meaningful sense. Somebody with an interest in old home sites could have been examining the well's construction, counting the stone courses, measuring the diameter. There are people who do that. There are people who catalog old wells the way other people catalog covered bridges or one-room schoolhouses. Southern Illinois has a whole subculture of history hikers and relic hunters who spend their weekends doing exactly this kind of thing. But they don't come back at night. They don't circle the same well 4 times. And they don't leave smooth-soled prints, because anyone who regularly walks off-trail in the Shawnee's hollows wears boots with traction, because the alternative is falling on your back on a sandstone slope and sliding 30 feet into a creek. Smooth-soled shoes are what you wear when you don't expect to be walking on rough ground, or when you changed out of your hiking shoes for some reason and walked to the well in whatever you had on. Russ got the trail camera set up on Wednesday. He positioned it on a tree about 15 feet from the well, aimed to cover the approach from the south, the path we'd found leading up to the ridge. The camera was a Reckonix, motion activated, with a no-glow infrared flash that wouldn't alert anyone that they were being photographed. Then we waited. The first week produced nothing. The camera captured deer, a doe, and 2 yearlings that came through the hollow every morning around 6. A raccoon, a coyote, a turkey hen with a string of poults, the usual cast of characters for that part of the Shawnee in April. The second week, Russ pulled the card on a Thursday. He called me that evening while I was cooking dinner. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Not alarm, something flatter. "You need to come look at this," he said. I drove to his house in Golconda. He had the images loaded on his laptop at his kitchen table. His wife was watching television in the next room. He'd already gone through them and flagged the relevant ones. There were 14 images, all from the same night the previous Monday, starting at 2:47 a.m. and ending at 3:12 a.m. 25 minutes. The camera had captured a person at the well. The images were infrared, so that they were grayscale, and the resolution at 15 feet in darkness was adequate, but not sharp. The person was wearing dark pants and a light-colored shirt or jacket. They appeared to be male based on build, though it was hard to be certain. Their face was never clearly visible. In some frames they were turned away, and in others the angle and the infrared exposure washed out their features. But the behavior was clear. In the first image, the person was standing at the rim of the well, looking down. In the second, taken 8 seconds later, they had moved about 90 degrees around the well. In the third, another 90 degrees. In the fourth, they were back near their starting position, circling. The sequence continued. The person circled the well repeatedly. In some frames, they were standing still. In some, they were moving. In one frame, the 9th image, time-stamped 3:04 a.m., they appeared to be kneeling at the rim with one arm extended down into the shaft. In the 12th image, they were standing again, holding something. The resolution wasn't good enough to identify the object. It was dark, irregularly shaped, roughly the size of a loaf of bread. In the 13th image, they were walking away, south, toward the path that led up to the ridge. In the 14th image, the hollow was empty. I sat at Russ's kitchen table and looked at those 14 images for a long time. His wife came in and refilled his coffee without asking what we were looking at. And I remember thinking that this was a household where work followed Russ home often enough that she didn't need to ask. I said, "They're putting things in or taking things out?" Russ nodded. "How long has this been happening?" He didn't answer because neither of us knew. I took the images back to the district office and showed them to my supervisor, Dave Keller, on Friday morning. Dave had been on the Shawnee longer than me, 22 years, most of it in timber and recreation management before moving to law enforcement supervision. He was methodical and extremely difficult to rattle, which I generally appreciated. He studied the images without saying anything for several minutes. Then he asked 3 questions. Was there an active missing persons case connected to the well? No. Was there evidence of a crime? No, not clearly trespassing on forest land is a violation, but proving it from a trail camera image of someone walking at night would be borderline impossible. Was the well itself a safety hazard that needed to be addressed regardless? Yes. Dave's conclusion was that we should focus on the hazard abatement angle. Flag the well, post signage on the nearest section of the river-to-river trail warning of unmarked hazards, and continue monitoring with the camera. If the visitor turned out to be a local with a benign explanation, a relic hunter, a historical researcher, someone with a personal connection to the old homestead, we'd deal with it as a minor trespass at worst. If the behavior escalated or connected to something else, we'd reassess. It was a reasonable institutional response. It was exactly what the situation warranted based on the available evidence. And I hated it, which surprised me. I think the reason I hated it was that I'd been looking at the 9th image, the one where the person was kneeling at the rim with their arm in the well, and I couldn't make it fit into any version of benign explanation that my experience supported. I'd been in those hollows at night. I'd been on patrol in parts of the Shawnee where the darkness is so complete that your headlamp feels like an insult. This tiny cone of light surrounded by a volume of black that seems to have weight. Nobody goes to a well at 3 a.m. in a hollow half a mile from the nearest road to do historical research. But Dave wasn't wrong. Strangeness is not a crime. Being unable to explain someone's behavior is not probable cause. And my gut feeling, however strong, was not evidence. We continued monitoring. Russ pulled the camera card every week. For the next 3 weeks, nothing. The deer came and went. The turkey hen lost 2 of her poults, which was normal for the predation rate in that area. No human visitors. Then, on a Tuesday night in mid-May, the camera captured the person again. This time, there were only 6 images, spanning 9 minutes. The behavior was the same, circling the well, pausing, moving again. But in the 3rd image, the person was clearly placing something into the well. Their arm was extended over the rim, and below their hand was a dark shape, caught mid-drop. In the 4th image, their hands were empty, and they were standing upright. In the 6th image, they were gone. I went to the well the next morning. Not alone, Russ met me at the gate. We descended into the hollow and approached the well together. The water level had dropped since March. The spring rains had tapered off, and the water table was falling as it does every year heading into summer. I could see about 3 feet more of the shaft wall than I'd been able to see in March. And I could see new objects on the water's surface. A shoe. Not a boot, a regular shoe. Dark leather, lace-up. Men's. Sitting on the water as if someone had set it there gently. Beside it, a folded piece of fabric that looked like a shirt. And something else, half submerged, that I couldn't identify from the rim. Russ and I looked at each other. He said, "Someone's been feeding this thing all along." He didn't mean the well was alive. He meant that the items we'd recovered in March, the backpack, the boot, the cord, the bottle, weren't the remnants of an accident. They were deposits. Someone had been placing objects in the well deliberately over an unknown period of time, and the items the hikers found floating on the surface were simply the ones that hadn't sunk yet. That reframing changed everything. I called Dave. He authorized a full recovery. This time I coordinated directly with the SAR team and requested that they bring equipment to pump the well if possible. I wanted to see the bottom. The recovery happened the following Saturday. Gary's team came back. Russ was there. Dave drove down from Vienna to observe, which he rarely did for field operations, and which told me he was taking this more seriously than his calm, procedural guidance had suggested. They rigged the tripod again. Beck volunteered to descend again. This time, she went down with a submersible pump attached to 50 feet of discharge hose. The pumping took over an hour. The well recharged slowly from the water table, so they couldn't drain it completely. But they got the level down far enough for Beck to stand on the bottom in chest waders and work by headlamp. What she brought up, item by item, handed to Gary in a bucket on a rope. A pair of men's dress shoes, black, size 10, leather, laces tied. a woman's hiking boot, left foot only, Columbia brand, size 8. A flannel shirt, red and black plaid, men's large, folded. A canvas tote bag containing 3 sealed Ziploc bags, each holding a piece of clothing, a child's sock, a woman's glove, a baseball cap, a coil of nylon rope approximately 30 feet, a plastic jug, gallon-sized, empty, sealed with its original cap, a single work glove, leather, right hand, a pair of eyeglasses, wire-framed with both lenses intact, and, at the very bottom, silted into the mud that had accumulated over decades, a collection of older objects that Beck couldn't fully excavate. What felt like more shoes, more fabric, and what she described as something hard and flat like a plate or a stone. 17 items total recovered from the accessible depth. Russ and I laid them out on a tarp and photographed everything. None of the items were connected to each other in any obvious way. Different sizes, different styles, different apparent ages. The dress shoes looked relatively new. The canvas tote bag was weathered. The clothing ranged from contemporary synthetic blends to older cotton and wool. The eyeglasses had a style that could have been from the 90s or from last year. The Ziploc bags were the detail that I keep coming back to. Someone had sealed individual pieces of clothing in waterproof bags before placing them in the well. That's not how you dispose of junk. That's not how you throw things away. You seal things in Ziploc bags when you want to preserve them. The Pope County Sheriff's Office took custody of the items. They ran every piece against missing persons databases, state, regional, NCIC. The eyeglasses were submitted for prescription analysis, which could potentially narrow down an owner. The clothing was cataloged and stored as evidence. Nothing matched. Not one item connected to a reported disappearance or a known case. Dave sat in his truck after the recovery and told me something I hadn't expected. He said that when he'd first transferred to the Shawnee in the late 90s, one of the retiring recreation staff had mentioned offhand, during the kind of transition briefing that's really just 2 people driving around for a day, that certain hollows in Pope County had a reputation among the older locals. Not a supernatural reputation, more practical. He said the locals called some of the old home site wells keeping wells. He'd asked what that meant, and the recreation staffer had shrugged and said, "People keep things in them." Dave had never followed up on it. There was no reason to. It sounded like a local idiom for people using abandoned wells as informal dumps, which is common across rural America. You find car batteries, old appliances, tires, paint cans, illegal but mundane. This wasn't mundane. Sealed Ziploc bags, tied shoes, folded shirts. A systematic, careful, repeated behavior carried out at 3 in the morning by someone who drove to a forest road, walked a quarter mile to a hollow, circled the well multiple times, placed items inside, and left. And here's what I haven't said yet, because I've been organizing this the way I experienced it. And the next part is where the experience changed for me. After the recovery, I became preoccupied. That's the honest word. My wife would use a less generous one. I pulled county plat maps and overlaid them with the 1930s-era Forest Service acquisition records to identify every homestead site in my patrol area that was likely to have a well. I found 43 probable locations within a 15-mile radius. I printed them on a topo map and started visiting them. I did this on my own time, weekends and days off. And I did it with my wife, Carla. She's not law enforcement. She's an occupational therapist at the hospital in Harrisburg. But she grew up in Saline County. She's hiked the Shawnee since she was a kid. And when I told her what we'd found, she wanted to see the sites herself. She also told me, accurately, that I was becoming obsessive, and that if I was going to do this, I should at least have company so that when I inevitably fell into a well, someone would know where I was. So we checked them. Not all 43, some were on private land, some were in terrain too rough to justify a speculative visit. But over the course of June and into early July, we visited 19 homestead wells in the hollows between Eddyville and the Lusk Creek drainage. 14 were dry, collapsed, silted in, or too shallow to hold water. Normal. 3 held water but contained nothing unusual. Leaf litter, branches, the occasional piece of old farm debris, a hinge, a piece of wire fencing. 2 held objects. The first was in a hollow about 4 miles northwest of the original well. Carla spotted the home site from the ridge. She saw the yucca plants, which I'd mentioned to her as an indicator. And she found the foundation within 10 minutes. The well was 30 feet from the house, uphill, exactly where you'd expect it. I shined my flashlight down and saw a shoe floating on the water. A single running shoe, men's white with a blue stripe, relatively new. The second was in a hollow about 6 miles southeast, closer to the Ohio River bluffs. This one was harder to find. The well rim had partially collapsed, and the opening was only about 18 inches across. But I got down on my stomach and directed the light in, and I could see, on a ledge about 5 feet down, where the stonework had shifted, a neat row of objects: a folded bandana, a pocket knife, closed, a small dark bottle that might have been a medicine vial, and a single key on a ring, placed precisely in the center of the bandana, as if it had been arranged there on purpose. Nobody had thrown these things down a well. They'd been placed, arranged. I reported both wells to Dave. He added them to the case file that the sheriff's office was building, though case was generous. There was still no identified crime, no identified victim, and no identified suspect. The trail camera at the original well had not captured the visitor again after the May images. But the case file now documented 3 separate wells spanning a 6-mile stretch of Pope County hollow country, all containing deliberately placed personal items. Different items, different wells, the same careful, intentional placement. The sheriff's investigator, who'd been assigned the file, a detective named Wanda Torres, who worked out of the Metropolis office, drove down to meet with me and Russ in late July. She'd reviewed the camera images, the recovery inventory, and the locations of all 3 wells. She told us, flatly, that she'd seen something similar once before, years ago, in Massac County. A farmer had found a sinkhole on his property with shoes in it. 3 pairs, all different sizes, all tied. He'd reported it, the department had documented it, and nothing had ever come of it. She said the Massac County sinkhole was 30 miles from our wells. Wanda wasn't speculating about connections. She was sharing information. She said that in her professional experience, the most likely explanation was a person with a compulsive behavior, something ritualistic, possibly related to grief, possibly related to a mental health condition. She said people develop private rituals around loss all the time, and some of those rituals involve objects and locations that have personal symbolic significance. She said it was possible that the wells themselves were the point, not what was in them, but the act of placing things inside them. I asked her about the circling. She said she didn't have an explanation for that. Russ asked her whether the items could be connected to actual people, whether each shoe, each shirt, each pair of glasses might belong to someone specific. She said that was the question that kept her up, and that the answer was that she couldn't rule it out, and she couldn't confirm it, and that without a single match in any database, she had no investigative path forward. The trail camera stayed up through August. The visitor didn't return. Russ eventually pulled it in September, when bow season started, and we needed the cameras for poaching surveillance. The sheriff's office kept the evidence in storage. Wanda told me she'd flag the file for review if anything new surfaced, but that without a complainant, a victim, or a suspect, it was going to sit. And that's where it sat. For 5 years now. But I haven't told you about the last time I was at the original well. And this is the part that made the rule. In late August 2019, about a week before Labor Day, I was in that part of the district on a routine patrol, checking campsites along the river-to-river trail for fire ring compliance. Which sounds tedious because it is. I was about a mile from the hollow. The day was hot, mid-90s, the kind of dense southern Illinois heat where the humidity makes the air feel like a physical substance. I'd been thinking about the wells on and off all summer. The preoccupation had faded from its peak, but hadn't disappeared. It was more of a background hum by then. The kind of unresolved thing that surfaces when you're driving a forest road alone and your mind isn't occupied. I decided to walk to the well, check on it, see if anything had changed. It was mid-afternoon, broad daylight, and I was in uniform with my radio on my chest. I descended into the hollow. The creek was low late summer, barely a trickle. The daffodils were long gone, but the yucca was easy to spot. I walked to the well. The flagging tape I'd put up in March was still there, faded from orange to a pale salmon color. The well looked the same. I knelt at the rim and looked in. The water level was lower than it had been in May. I could see more of the shaft. Maybe the top 8 feet were dry, with the water starting below that. The walls were green-black with moisture and algae. There was nothing floating on the surface. The well looked empty. I was about to stand up when I heard something that I've spent the years since trying to describe accurately and failing. It came from the well. Not an echo of something from above. Not water dripping. Not an animal. It was a sound that rose from the shaft, the way warm air rises gradually, without a clear starting point. It was low, and it was rhythmic. And the closest comparison I can give is that it sounded like breathing. Not human breathing, not animal breathing. A mechanical rhythm, like the slow cycling of a pump. Except there was no pump, and there was no mechanism, and there was nothing in that well but stone and water and whatever was silted into the mud at the bottom. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I was still kneeling at the rim. My hands were on the stone. I could feel the stone vibrating, not dramatically, not like a motor, but a faint tremor, the way a pipe vibrates when water moves through it somewhere far away. The vibration stopped when the sound stopped. I stood up. I backed away from the well. I walked out of the hollow and up to the ridge, and I did not stop until I was back on the forest road, standing next to my truck with my hand on the door handle. I was breathing hard, not from the climb. I was angry. That's the part I didn't expect. I wasn't frightened, or maybe I was. And the fear expressed itself as anger, because that's how I'm wired. I was angry because I had spent 5 months building a careful, evidence-based understanding of a strange but potentially explicable situation. And in 15 seconds, the well had made all of that feel irrelevant. Whatever was happening in those hollows, the person on the trail camera was a footnote. The shoes and the shirts and the Ziploc bags, those were footnotes. The thing I should have been paying attention to was the well itself. And I had been looking into it from the rim like a tourist this entire time. And then the anger was gone. And what replaced it was something quieter and worse. A feeling that I had been noticed. Not by a person, not by an animal. By the geometry of the place itself, the narrow shaft, the water, the stone walls, the air column rising from whatever depth the well actually reached. I had put my face over that rim, and something at the bottom of it had acknowledged me. I don't go near open wells alone anymore. That's the rule. It's not in any manual. It's not in any training. It's mine. The Pope County case file is still open, technically. Wanda Torres retired in 2022. The evidence is in a storage locker in Metropolis. Nobody has checked the wells since September 2019. Nobody has reported any new items. The trail camera images sit on a thumb drive in my desk drawer at home, because I made copies before the originals went to the sheriff's office. And sometimes I look at the 9th image, the one where the person is kneeling at the rim with their arm extended into the dark, and I think about how their posture doesn't look like someone reaching down. It looks like someone being reached for. Carla asked me once why I copied those images. She asked if I was planning to go back. I told her no. She said, "Then why do you keep looking at them?" I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. But I'll say this. Of the 19 wells we checked that summer, the 3 that held objects were the 3 that were deepest. The 3 where you couldn't see the bottom. The 3 where, if you held still and listened, you might hear something that you'd spend the rest of your career deciding not to describe. I have a partner now. The district finally got a 4th officer in 2021. His name is Miguel, and he's young, and he's competent. And when we patrol the hollows in Pope County, I always find a reason to make sure we're together. He's asked me once why I won't check a well by myself. I told him it was a safety rule. Slip hazard. No cell signal in the hollows. Standard precaution. He accepted that. He shouldn't have. The real answer is that I don't trust what I'll hear if I kneel at a rim alone again. And I don't trust what I'll do about it. The wells are still out there. 17 items recovered. 3 wells documented. 43 probable sites unvisited. And 1 person on a trail camera who knelt in the dark, reached into a hole in the ground, and circled it like a prayer. If that's the kind of thing that keeps you listening, subscribe to Ashwarden Horror. Some of the things I've seen on this forest have explanations. Some of them have almost explanations. And a few of them just have wells.